Um, Everybody, I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here this evening. And congratulations for coming into the program. And I know you've got a couple more weeks left and you've got a little bit of work to do. And hopefully I'm going to give you some guidance that'll help you prepare for August the 6th. Before I get started, I do a lot of work with Indigenous entrepreneurs, and I've learned about land acknowledgement, and I start all of my workshops now with a land acknowledgement. So I just want to say that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of Scugog, Hiawatha, and Alderville First Nations, and the Métis Nation. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The treaties that were signed for this particular parcel of land are collectively referred to as the Williams Treaties of 1923. I encourage you that if you're not familiar with the Indigenous history of where you are or any place in Canada that you might be, that it's useful and worthwhile to learn about it. And it's certainly one of the things that I've done with, as a result of doing all the work I've done with Indigenous entrepreneurs. And I've done that for a few years, notably in New Brunswick. On to the topic at hand. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. And the reason for this is it gives you context for where I'm coming from when I'm talking about pitching. I'm not coming at it from exclusively an investor point of view or exclusively an entrepreneur point of view. I've done both of those things. As an entrepreneur, in C-level roles in startup companies, I've raised over $40 million. So I know what it's like there to be out there with my hat in my hand, asking for people to part with their hard-earned money, even though I don't have enough money in the company bank account, or I don't have customers, or I don't have product yet. So I know what that's like. I've also been an angel investor, so I know what it's like to look at opportunities and make a decision for my own portfolio. I sit on the investment committee of the Laurier Startup Fund, so I know what it's like when other people do the due diligence and bring their recommendations forward. And I've done lots of education and advisory and mentor work in the startup ecosystem. Founder Institute has called me Canada's best pitch coach. Communitech has called me a startup whisperer. I would really like to be the best pitch coach in the world. So, I'm not satisfied with Canada's best pitch coach. I've done the work that I do with well over 1,000 companies. There's not very many situations that I haven't seen. And if I see something new, I can figure things out usually. And it's all that I do these days. I don't have any other operational roles. All I do is I work with people, helping them put the best foot forward, the best pitch forward for whatever purpose. And we're going to get into that now as we go through this. This is my logo soup, so you can see where I've done this. I've done it all over the place. And in fact, I've worked with companies all over the world with the help of programs like the DMZ YYZ program. So in the last couple of weeks, I worked with companies in Moscow, Budapest, Tokyo, Sudan, and a few other places, not to mention a number of places across Canada. I'm very happy to be here speaking with you today. I'd like to make today as interactive as possible. It's harder when you're on Zoom to make it interactive, but by all means, if you have a question that really needs answering for you to be able to figure out how we go forward with this, by all means, I invite you to interrupt. If you don't get my attention verbally, then please use the chat or the hands that go up. And Gabemi, you're going to be monitoring the chat, is that right?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, I won't be monitoring the chat, but Gabemi will be. And if he sees something there, he'll interrupt me if you don't. This is certainly your session, not mine. I know this stuff. I've heard it a few times. And a PDF of this deck will be provided after this, so you don't have to take really tons of notes. I know some people like to take notes, and that's okay, but you will get a copy of this deck later. As you see, this deck is going to cover a lot of ground, but that's because the focus of today is to help you, number one, for the August 6th DMZ pitch, My understanding is you're being asked to pitch for 3 to 5 minutes, give or take, and be prepared for a couple of minutes of Q&A. We're going to do this by reviewing and discussing the best practices for pitching, generally speaking. So I'm going to take you through a framework for pitching as if you were a fully formed company ready to pitch to investors for funding. So I want you to see what that overall framework looks like. And then we're going to use that overall framework to say, how do you specifically prepare for August 6th? Because August 6th is not a pitch to investors. It's a different pitch, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I want to be able to give you the full picture before narrowing down to August 6th. This means that we're really looking to the future to prepare for today. As far as the future goes, when you think about that full pitch, it's what does that full pitch look like? What do you have to do to prepare for success? And then we're going to work backwards from that to say, what are the objectives for your August 6th pitch event, and how do you set up for success for that event? So the big framework will give you the ability to look at a smaller framework for August the 6th. It's a number of takeaways that you're going to get from today. I'm going to, in a moment, talk about a number of different aspects of pitching. There are some subtle and not so subtle differences about pitching to groups versus pitching to individuals. And I'd like to talk about those things. I'm also going to talk about what it means to pitch at competitions versus to investors and what those differences are. And then I'm going to get into the pitch framework. I'm going to talk about something called Vegas. I'll give you a pitch self-assessment. So you'll actually have a checklist that you can use for yourself to evaluate your pitches. I'm going to talk specifically about how you prep for August the 6th, and I'll give you some closing thoughts. In the course of going through all of this, you're going to get a lot of material. I'm going to more or less fly through the big framework, partly because of the limitation of time. And I asked Abemi earlier this evening if it would be a problem if we went a few minutes late. I probably will go a little past 8 o'clock. But that's because I really want you to get this grounding of information to help you think about August 6th. You're going to get a lot of stuff. I'm going to fly through much of it, but I will pause a few times for questions just in case I don't get interrupted. And then we'll hopefully have a little bit of discussion time at the end. So first thing I'm going to get into is a little bit about pitching. Specifically, why do I call what I do the artful science of pitching? And the reason I call it artful science is the art piece is how you figure out what to say about your company, even though the company doesn't have perfect information. Examples would be, I don't have clients yet. I don't have a fully formed product yet. Maybe I'm only at an MVP. I'm running out of money in the bank. Can you please give me some funding to support this company? I don't have a full team. It's just me and one other person, and we're doing everything. And we're living on ramen noodles, and we need help, but we need money. How do you tell a story given all of those things? And I'll talk about all of that. Then the science part is this represents how people evaluate you and your pitch. I don't mean a capital S science, but a small s science. They literally have formal criteria if it's a competition, or informal criteria if you're speaking to angel investors who see a lot of pitches and they're thinking to themselves, well, I'm looking for certain things and I'm listening for certain things. They literally have check boxes in their head where they're checking things off as you're covering them. And the audiences could be potential investors. It could be potential strategic partners or distribution partners. It could be talent that you're trying to hire. It could be customers, right? So sales pitch is a form of a pitch. And it could be an internal pitching situation where you're trying to get the team on board for a new strategy. So pitching takes on all of these kinds of purposes. And you'll see as we go through this, there's a way of addressing all of these. Pitching to me is a little bit like looking at an iceberg. The part of the iceberg that's above the surface of the water, that's what you're exposing to people when you're pitching. It's as perfect a pitch as you can get. It doesn't tell the full story because you can't talk about all the stuff that's below the surface. You never have enough time to do that. But the important thing is whoever is listening to your story is going to draw conclusions about what's below the surface based on what they're hearing and based on what you're saying. And they know that everything is likely not perfect below the surface. There are going to be sharks, there's going to be some toxic stuff, there's going to be, competitive forces at play, there could be some cultural issues, the team is not getting along together, all those kinds of things happen in not only startups, but also mature companies. But what you say in that iceberg that's above the water is really going to set the tone for what I'm starting to conclude about your business. And I'm going to start asking myself, are the dots connecting here? Does one part of the pitch make sense with another part of the pitch? And do they make sense with a third part of the pitch? And if they don't make sense, I'm going to start believing your pitch less and less. If they do make sense, then you're accomplishing one of the things you have to do, which is convince me that that this is a company worth paying attention to or worth investing. The other thing for you to consider is, does the pitch that you're delivering jive with any other collateral that might be out there about your company? For example, if you're speaking to DMZ on August the 6th and you applied to the program with some information about the company, that might have been circulated with the DMZ. And if your company is different today or different on August the 6th than what you originally submitted, one of the things you want to do is to provide context by saying, we've undergone a couple of changes in the last few weeks. The major thing you need to understand about our change is ABC. So providing that context becomes really good because it lessens the confusion in the audience about your pitch. I'm going to talk about a couple of other aspects of pitching. There is a very important difference when you're pitching to people in a group scenario versus a one-on-one scenario. And let me talk a bit about that. When you're pitching to a group for X number of minutes, an example is you're going to be pitching on August the 6th for 3 to 5 minutes. That means that for 3 to 5 minutes, you own the room, you own the stage, you're not going to get interrupted, likely not going to get interrupted with questions, and you have the ability to tell the story, a story about your business. Not only do you have the ability to tell the story, the audience is expecting you to tell a story about your business. Meaning there's kind of a beginning to the story, there's a middle to the story, and there's an end to the story. They know that if they're there to listen to something and you're not getting to that point at the beginning, they're going to have the patience to wait until the end because they know you've got 5 minutes or 3 minutes to fill. And you're probably going to get to that important thing that I need to know. If you don't, then that opens up the door to questions at the end. But if it's really a really important thing, you need to cover it in the pitch. So that's when you're pitching to an audience, a group audience, and you have X number of minutes to pitch. The second situation is when you're in a one-on-one meeting. It could be with an angel investor. It could be with somebody you're trying to hire. It could be with a potential partner. It could be with a customer. It could be with an advisor or mentor at DMZ, and you're trying to pitch to that person because you're trying to get into a specific program. When you're doing these one-on-one pitches, in those instances, the person you're talking to likely, quote unquote, owns the room. Unlike the interactive pitch where you own the podium or own the stage for 3 or 5 or 8 minutes, in this case, they own the room. What that means is if they don't understand something that you're saying in your pitch, they're likely going to interrupt you with a question. And that throws you off your cadence. And it sometimes is hard to recover from that because you'll be faced with a situation where you'll say, I have the answer to that, but it's on slide 15. Can you wait for a few minutes until I get to slide 15? If they're nice, if they're Canadian, they might say, okay, I'll wait, but they'll only do that once. Okay. The next time they have a question, they're going to say, no, like, stop for a second. I'm not following what you're saying. You need to answer my question so that I can understand where your pitch came from and where it's going. So in those kinds of situations, when you're pitching one-on-one, it's very important to redesign your pitch a little bit so that you get your key information up front and give the audience things to think about so that they can start formulating good questions quickly. As soon as the good questions come, that's when you're going to celebrate in your head because the dialogue has started. And what you're trying to do is to get to a dialogue in the one-on-one meetings. So just a subtle difference between how you design your pitch for group meetings versus one-on-one meetings. And I just wanted to highlight that, that you really have to think about that when you design your pitch. So what is a pitch? I get asked sometimes, how do you define a pitch? Well, by definition, the objective of a pitch is to influence behavior, right? You're not trying to close a deal necessarily. You're trying to influence behavior. Let's look at what this means. So if you're pitching to potential investors and partners, what you're trying to do is to get to the next meeting, especially if it's the first pitch, you want to get to a second meeting. If it's a second meeting, you want to get to the third meeting. Closing an investment or closing a partnership deal is typically a process that takes time, and you're trying to keep the process going by keeping that next meeting going. Eventually, that next meeting is going to be the last meeting, and you're going to meet in a lawyer's office. You're going to sign a bunch of paper, and there's going to be a check that moves from one side of the table to the other. That's what you're trying to work towards. That's typically the case in investors and partners. But let's look at some other cases. If you're pitching to a potential customer, yes, you'd like them to buy, but if you're in a situation where you're selling to enterprise, especially if you're selling to enterprise, what you really have to do is use the pitch as the opportunity to understand their needs and to convince them of the next steps. And the next steps might be, let's have another meeting, or who do you want me to meet with next? Or can we get an agreement to do a pilot? Or maybe it's a short sales cycle and you say, I have a sales contract right here. Would you like to buy today? So it's always about understanding their needs so that you can pitch to the needs. Okay, it's very different than potential investors, especially if the investors is a group kind of pitch. The other one here is you might be pitching to talent. And when you're pitching to talent, your objective is you want to hire them. And so your objective is to get them to say, pick us. So you're trying to influence behavior there. You want them to pick you over other options. Now, let's talk about what a pitch is not. The objective of a pitch is not to educate. And I'm calling this out specifically because what I see often happen with people who start pitching for the first time is you have everybody, this is human nature, you have this want and need to tell people everything you're doing and why you're doing it and all the details behind it. And I can assure you most audiences really don't care about those details until they do. And that means you don't talk about those things until they start drawing it out from you. So a pitch by definition is not an opportunity to educate. If you're pitching to potential investors, partners, customers, or talent, you don't use the pitch to educate them about your industry or the product, especially the product, or the business. You stay focused on the next steps until or unless they drive the dialogue to education. So at some point you might be pitching to an investor and you've been very careful to not design the pitch to educate, but you're telling them all the right things. We're going to get into that in a moment. And at some point they ask a question and they say, well, I don't know your industry all that well, so can you take a moment and just explain ABC to me? When they do that, that is your invitation to go away from your pitch strategy and give them a bit of education. And it's a good thing because they've asked for it. They've opened up that door. But once you address their question, then get back into the pitch mode until they ask for more. And I'm talking here about kind of the first pitch you would have with somebody. Once they've initiated that next meeting and you go into a process called due diligence, they're going to be very interested in some of the details, but you save it for then. I'm going to pause just for a moment here to make sure that there's no unanswered questions that need to be answered before I move on. I'm going to talk about investor pitches versus competitions in a moment. So I'll just pause for a moment. Are there any questions that I could answer?
So Frank, I have a question. You mentioned that the role is not to educate, but if you have a complex concept, how best to be able to, deal with the complexity, but at the same time, you're not educating? Like, what would you say? What would you recommend?
Your name is Fauzia?
Yes, correct.
Fauzia, I really like your question. It's a great question. All businesses have certain degrees of complexity. They certainly are complex once you start taking the covers off and you start to look at, what's the real sales process? What's the real problem that's being solved? How does the solution work? If you're manufacturing something, how does the manufacturing work? Where is it being manufactured? If it's a hardware piece, that's certainly complex. The challenge that we have as pitchers is to shield the audience from all that complexity. So the challenge really is not about how do I explain the complexity, it's how do I explain a complex thing in an easy to consume way. And I've been through this so many times with people who start by telling me, my business is really complex. It takes me 15 minutes to explain my business. And at the end of that, people don't get it. And I assure them, I can get you to talk about your business in 3 minutes and they'll get it at the end of it. And we usually have a few go-arounds there, but we can get it there. So it's a matter of practice. It's getting some good advice about how you do that. It's what I do almost every day that I meet with people is how do I strip out some of that complexity? And you'll notice I'm trying not to say, make it simple. Because to me, making it simple is not the answer. It's making it easy to consume. It's making a complex message easy to consume, which you could argue is about simplifying it, but to me, the context is very different. So Fauzia, I hope I answered your question, but it's one of the big challenges that everybody has when they're pitching their business, and everybody eventually gets there.
You did. Thank you so much, Frank.
Okay, you're welcome. I'll take one more question if there is one before I move on.
Just kind of connected to that. Thank you, Frank, so far. So back to that education piece. I found that when I try to do the kind of directly talking about the business part and not educate, I feel like I get blank faces. It's like I feel like they don't follow me if I don't spend a little time talking about the sector. So that has been a difficult thing for me. When I try to go straight to the business talk, it's like I feel like I lose people quick. But when I do my education piece, and then I'm spending 5 minutes just educating, and I don't get to what I'm actually trying to do.
Okay, Nadia, thanks for the clarification. And I want to be really careful here. When I say don't educate, I'm not talking on a scale of 0 to 100 all the way to 0. Okay, there is usually some level of small e education that's required, but I don't call it education. I'll give you an example. Let's say that we're selling a product to enterprises. Well, one of the things I have to know is who's your target buyer? Who's your target market? What problems are you solving for them? What's your value proposition? You could say all those are education, but they're really not. Those are all features of your business. So if we stick to the features of the business and not go a couple of degrees down from there into what I call education, then we're okay. So, on that scale of 0 to 100, it's not 0 or 100. It's somewhere in the middle, focused on the things that matter. Okay. You'll see a little bit later as we get into the framework, there are some pieces of information that are necessary to put on the table for an investor to understand what your business is all about. And, if you're talking to investors, most investors have seen many different kinds of companies, and they pick up on these things very quickly, but you have to lead them to the pond. And if you don't lead them to the right pond, they're going to go to the bad pond and drink the bad water. And you don't want to do that, right? So I hope I've clarified a little bit. It's not about no education, so to speak, but it's about important things. Okay?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to push on, and I'll have another pause here shortly to talk more about any questions that you may have. The next thing I want to talk about is what's the difference between pitching to, let's say, a group of investors at a pitch event or a one-on-one meeting versus going into a competition to pitch. And there's lots of competitions that happen where there's a prize at the end. It's not unusual to see pitch competitions out there that have, $50,000 or $100,000 prizes, or entrance into a program as a prize, or in-kind services as a prize. So when you go into those, what's the strategy that you have to have for those? Because they're a little different than pitching just to investors trying to get the next meeting. If you win the competition, of course, you'll probably get the next meeting with a number of people, but how do you win? And, if you look at this table, you'll see that for regular pitch events and for one-on-one pitch events, it's what I talked about earlier. Your objective is the next meeting. You have control of the room for N number of minutes, or the host has control of the room. You want to tell a story to a pitch event. For a one-on-one meeting, you want to have a strong opening. The difference for a judged event is most judged events publish the criteria that they're looking for at the event. So number one, you need to get your hands on the criteria. Number two, you need to know who the judges are, because the judges, knowing who the judges are and what their background is, might help you fine tune your pitch. And you need to be able to address the criteria, but not in the way that it might seem obvious to you. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Always rehearse your pitch in Q&A, tune it for your situation, and remember that the world is small. You might be pitching to a person who looks like an investor today, and tomorrow you discover that they're also a potential client, and then later you find out, holy cow, I might actually hire this person. And you want to make sure that you have the same core story across those three audiences, because people talk and people remember. And the last thing that I'll say on this page is never set yourself up for a bad next meeting. And what I mean by that is don't oversell your business, don't oversell you. Avoid being hyperbolic about your business. If you have a business plan that you've put together and you've maxed out all the variables, and when you do that, it says you're going to have $1 million in revenue next year, but that's only if everything goes right and everything gets maxed out. Don't say that in the pitch, because people are going to think, oh, this is $1 million business next year. I'm going to go meet with them. Then when you meet with them and you have to fess up to them that, oh, that was dependent on maxing out all the variables, they're going to say, wait a second now, this feels like a bit of a bait and switch now, because you weren't really transparent. You weren't really as honest as you should have been with me about the business's outlook. So, avoid doing that. You need to be a little bit cautious. Yes, we want to be able to promote our businesses and be proud of our businesses and, sell them to some extent. Just don't oversell them. Now let's look at competitions a little bit closer for a moment. So here is, these are two lists of criteria from real pitch competitions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just wanted to put them up so that you could see the kinds of things that the judges look for. They're a pretty representative list. In one case, the left side, judges were asked to score these on a scale of 1 to 10. On the right side, the rubric was a little bit different. It was basically 0 to 5. Judges sometimes use scales, sometimes they don't, but they always go back and talk after the pitches about what they saw. Even though these are the criteria they have, I want you to think about a couple of things for putting a good pitch together in a competition scenario. The first thing is simply addressing each of the topics is not good enough. If you go back to this list, if I put together a 10-page pitch or an 8-page pitch that covered all of these topics, that's not enough, because they're expecting a story about the business. They're not expecting, question 1, answer 1, question 2, answer 2. They're looking for a woven story about the business, something that's easy to follow. Remember what I said earlier about complexity in education, easy to follow. And the topics have to have some focus. It's not about covering everything. It's the key messages that matter. So, if you have a topic up there like competition, you're not going to give me a detailed analysis of the competition because you won't have time. So you get to the heart of the matter. The key thing here is you need to think about what matters based on the audience that you're pitching to. And what I mean here is do some research on who you're pitching to so you know what they look for. Maybe you find out what they've invested in the past, what stage do they invest in, what situation, and adjust your core story to meet the audience needs, appropriate for your stage and aligned with your situation. Okay, so you're fine-tuning. You're fine-tuning all the time.
Frank, there's a question here. Do you want to finish this segment first before you take a question? There's a question.
No, I'll take the question right now.
Oh, okay, yeah. Peter was asking that where does the average pitching audience put more weight, formal or informal criteria?
It depends on the event. If it's a competition, the emphasis is on the formal criteria. If you're pitching simply to angels or VCs that are out there looking for potential businesses to invest in, they'll have some level of formal criteria in their minds or maybe in their notebook, but by and large, they're looking at a lot of informal things, including things like how confident does this pitcher seem? How strong is the story? Does it make sense? Can they take a complex situation and tell me the things I need to know? How did they do answering my questions, right? The Q&A piece, and we'll talk more about this in a little while, how you perform in Q&A is, I would say, as important as delivering the pitch itself. So a lot of the things are going to be informal, but let's take a VC, for example. VCs will usually have a couple of very specific criteria, like I only invest in certain industries. I only invest in companies that have met certain milestones. I don't invest in companies that haven't achieved certain things. So, over time, you learn what those things are, and it never hurts to ask. One of the things I tell people is if you meet with an investor and they're doing their due diligence on you, it's okay for you to do due diligence on them by saying things like, I've read a little bit about your firm. I see some of the companies you've invested in. What's the average check size that you write? Now, it's okay to ask that, because if you're looking for $100,000 and you discover that their average check size is $500,000, you can be pretty sure they're probably not interested in you at this stage. So, don't waste your time, don't waste their time on too much. It's okay to establish a relationship, but asking these kinds of qualifying questions is actually a very good thing for you to do. And you'll learn how to do that over time. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody at the beginning, but you'll certainly learn it over time.
Thanks, Frank.
Okay, so a couple more things on this page. One is when it comes to design, don't underestimate the value of a clean, easy to consume design. If you look at my pages are not good examples of an investor pitch. That's because I am educating, right? So my pitch has more content. I have to talk to the pages a little bit differently. I present full sentences because I'm going to give you this page, this deck later, and I want you to understand what it says. But when you're pitching to people, you want them to look at your pitch and listen to you. So you want to give them as few words as possible to read, no complex diagrams, right? Because the complex diagram just gets them focused on trying to understand the diagram. And things like screenshots, right? If you took a screenshot of a phone or a screenshot of a laptop or a Mac, a PC or a Mac, and you put them up, most screenshots are not designed for presentation purposes. They're designed for user experience, user interface. So when you use a screenshot, you need to be really thoughtful about how you use it. And I encourage people to avoid screenshots as much as possible. If you are going to use it, then magnify the area that you want people to see and maybe fuzz out the things that you don't want them to read. Because if there's words there in small font, people will start concentrating on the small font and try to read what it says, and they've stopped listening to you. Okay, so last point on this slide is memorability. At the end of the day, what you're trying to achieve in a pitch is that people remember your pitch for good reasons, of course, not for bad reasons, right? They remember your pitch. So somebody goes to a pitch event, they see 5, 10, 15, 20 pitches. We did a pitch event in January of this year. We had almost 50 companies pitch 3 minutes back to back one morning. No introductions, just next person comes up on stage, gives their 3-minute pitch, next person comes up. So in that environment, how do you stand out? Well, one of the ways you stand out is you make it really easy for people to remember you and your pitch. And you do that by giving them something at the end, like, here's the 3 things I need you to remember from my pitch. All right, that's an example. So we'll talk a little bit more about memorability a little bit later. I need to motor on a little bit. So we've covered the 2 things on the left here, pitching to groups versus individuals and competitions versus to investors. I'm now going to do a walkthrough of a pitch framework. I'll eventually get to looking at prepping for August 6th. I can assure you I'm running past 8 o'clock right now. So hopefully people will have the ability to stick around for a bit, but I'll get through this. I just believe that there's a lot of good material for you here, particularly if this is the start of an entrepreneurial career for you. What I'm about to go through is going to be very important to you for the days that you start to prepare a pitch to talk to investors or other groups besides DMZ. Maybe you want to apply for a program somewhere. Maybe you want to pitch for some grant money, whatever the case may be. I'm going to take you through something that I call the artful science of pitching. It's a proven framework that I've used with way over 1,000 companies. And it's the framework I use for every single pitch that I evaluate. What I'm going to take you through is a pitch framework for the uninterrupted style of pitch. So this is the pitch you're going to give to a large group, no questions till the end. If you're creating your first pitch deck or you need to do a rebuild, this is a good framework to follow because it covers all the bases. And if you have an opportunity later to get into a one-on-one scenario, you can use pages from the master deck to be able to reorder them for a one-on-one setting. A very key point that I like to tell people is I sound like, or it's going to appear like, I'm very prescriptive about the order of topics. In fact, I'm not. I am, however, prescriptive about following the framework at the beginning of putting a pitch together, because I want to be able to see if the story makes sense. And this will make sense to you in a moment. Once we have that end-to-end set of topics nailed, I encourage people to reorder things as you need, because at the end of the day, the pitch is about you putting your best foot forward, not about saying to anybody, I followed Frank's framework. My framework doesn't matter at that point. It's all about you and your pitch. So with that as kind of the undertone, let me go through and talk a bit about this. There's 12 things that I'm going to talk about, and then a couple of things beyond that. As I said, order is less important. I've helped people get these 12 topics plus others done in 3 minutes. You know, I talked about those almost 50 companies that pitched in January. Every single one of them pitched within 3 minutes, and they covered all the important things for their business. So it's possible, it's very doable. Many have done it before you. You will get there too. There's an explanation to the color here, and I'm going to go through every one of these individually, so I'm not going to go through them all right now, but the colors mean some specific things. These subjects that I've got in yellow, they really serve no purpose in a pitch other than to capture somebody's interest. On their own, none of these things are enough for an investor to say, you know what, I want to learn more. I want to go into due diligence. I might invest in this company. These things are nothing more than table stakes. Every single company that is out there pitching, they have a problem to solve. They have usually large market sizes. They have a solution, and they can talk about why now and competitiveness. The difference is going to come in this thing called go-to-market. This is where the tables turn in an investor's mind, where they go from interest to beginning to think about, you know what, I think I might ping this person with a text message or call them or send them an email or invite them to a coffee because I'm interested in this. This is kind of interesting. I just need to learn a few more things. And we do that by crossing some T's and dotting some I's that allow us to lead to action. So there's 3 distinct sections here. The top part is get my interest, get the audience's interest as soon as you can. That stops them from thinking about getting a burger on the way home if they happen to be at an event, or it stops them from browsing somewhere else when they're on a Zoom. The middle piece is the reason they came to listen to the pitch. They want and need to hear about your go-to-market plans. That's the meat of the pitch. And then the stuff in black, those are things that just ice the cake to convince them to move forward. We're going to go through these one by one. So the first item is we're going to have a compelling opening. This is about having a good first impression. It starts the moment you start walking towards the stage or the moment that you appear on a Zoom screen. And you need to be able to show confidence. You need to provide some kind of intrigue at the beginning to capture that interest. You've often heard the phrase, I'm sure, what's your elevator pitch? Well, I encourage everybody to figure out how to tell a 7 to 15 second introduction to their company that causes the audience to say, ooh, that sounds interesting. I need to lean in and listen to this pitch because this sounds really cool. Now, I'll give you an example of elevator pitches in a moment. But you create something that captures that interest right away. People ask me, is this 1 or 2 pages? Well, you could do it on 1 page, but I really like to see it on 2 pages so that the second page becomes your elevator pitch page, and all it has is a couple of key phrases to tell me what space you're in and capture my interest. Let's go through a really quick example about the elevator pitch. It sets the context for the audience. It not only captures their interest, but it establishes the space that you're in so that they're not thinking at the beginning, well, so what business are they in? Like, what do they do? If you can tell something immediately at the beginning, it stimulates that potential interest. What you have to remember is the elevator pitch is not meant to be a recap of the rest of your pitch. You're not trying to jam 3 minutes or 8 minutes worth of content into a 15-second snippet. It's there for the purpose of grabbing my attention. Let me give you an example. This is an example of a true elevator pitch, right? So I'm on an elevator and somebody gets on the elevator and it happens to be a person named Pat that I've seen before. And I said, you know, Pat, or in this case, I've just met Pat. Pat, good to meet you. What do you do? And Pat says, actually, I've been hoping to run into you because I'm an investor, right? Pat says, I've been hoping to run into you. We have developed an optimally sized, open and standards compliant operating system for the Class A compatible and Class B microprocessor units found in low-end intelligent enabled devices. What do you think I'm doing on the elevator after I hear this? If I press the 45th button, I'm pressing 10 really quickly, right? because it's like, I don't understand what this person's talking about. Holy mackerel, right? What's there might be completely accurate, but it's completely meaningless, right? So if I'm pressing that next available floor, let's look at why. Well, there's a couple of things with this sentence, and I've repeated it here at the top. One is it's a really long sentence. It's hard for people to hear and interpret long sentences, partly because when we write long sentences, we put in commas and various other punctuations. Well, that's good when you're reading, but when you're speaking the sentence, I don't know where the comma is, and if you're not listening properly, it sounds like one long run-in sentence. And after I hear too many long syllable words, I stopped listening, right? I'm thinking, I got to get off at 10, right? There's gobbledygook in there. I mean, look at this, right? Optimally sized, standard line, class A, class B, microprocessor, et cetera. It's all gobbledygook. And Pat assumed correctly that the investor didn't read the audience. So the most important thing here is the elevator pitch does not set up for positive response. Yes.
You're breaking up. In the last few sentences you said you were breaking up. I don't know why. Is it
I don't know why either. I just moved my chair. Maybe that'll help. Is my voice better now?
It's better now, yeah.
Okay. The key point that I was making here, that most importantly, the elevator pitch as delivered by Pat does not set up for a positive response. When you're delivering an elevator pitch in an elevator, on the street, wherever, you are actually in almost complete control that the person you're speaking to is going to give you a positive response or a negative response. A negative response would be something like, I have no idea what you said. Or if you have an app that allows you to find low-priced hotel rooms, somebody might say, well, aren't there a million apps that do that? Those are negative, right? But if you give me something intriguing, I might say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's really interesting. Like, tell me more. That's positive. That's opening the doors. We could use the same process when we're trying to figure out what to do in a formal pitch. But let me show you a good elevator pitch now. So you see the bad one at the top? So good to meet you, Pat. What do you do? So Pat says, thanks for asking. I founded Smart CPU. We've developed a best-in-class operating system for smart devices like your toaster. We cost less and leave room for the apps that make your toaster smart. We're proven, and I need investment to commercialize. I'd love to tell you about our plans. All right. Completely different kind of elevator pitch in 15 seconds. Let's break it down here. I said thank you. I talked about what I've done in the name of the company. I've talked about what we've built, the purpose of the product. I've referred to a familiar device, value propositions. I've given him something intriguing to listen to, right? One of the things I could say after this is like, I never heard of a smart toaster. Like, that sounds kind of interesting. Tell me more, right? Status, stage, and ask. Use of proceeds. And I've asked for the next meeting, okay? 15 seconds, and I've covered all of that. Now, that's if you're meeting somebody and you want to be able to talk to them. If you're talking to, if you're looking at how to put this into a pitch, then on the left-hand side this is the full elevator pitch. This is how I might rewrite it for the purpose of a pitch. Smart CPU has developed a best-in-class operating system for smart devices like your toaster. We cost less and leave more room for the apps that make all of life smart and easy. And on my page, I might just have a few phrases like this. And by giving this, I've given the audience the space that I'm in and enough that makes it interesting for me to want to learn more. And if I know this space, then Pat, the presenter, has called out to me because, I'm into smart CPUs, I'm into microprocessor, I'm into IoT. I'm now listening to this, okay? So let's move on. Number 2, what problem are you solving? And this goes back to some of the questions we had earlier. If you're solving a complex, multifaceted problem, you have to figure out how to elevate that description to something that's easy to embrace, easy to consume. You need to include in that who experiences the problem, because that establishes who your target buyer or user is. Getting people to understand this up front is critical because it sets the stage for the next part of the pitch to come. So let's look at more. The next is, once I've established how this is the problem that I'm solving, now I want to tell you how many people experience this problem, because now I'm subtly telling the investor how scalable this business is. And they're going to come to their own conclusions in their mind when they're going to say, oh, that's a good problem. Oh, there's that many people that experience that problem. That is really cool. Now, I counsel people to try to avoid, unless it makes absolute sense, try to avoid putting market sizes out there in terms of dollars. Because most times when we say that this is a $4 billion market, or people spend $300 million in this space, those numbers are almost completely meaningless. When I ask questions about what those numbers mean, very few people can really give me a good answer. The way to give a good answer and the way to set up for the scalability conclusion is to give counts. Here's an example. So if I told you that I'm solving a problem that companies, I could give you 3 different descriptions for the market size. I could say the market size is 4 billion, or I could say that 1 million companies in our space, if they spent 4,000 with us a year, which is our price, it's a $4 billion opportunity. Or I could say 1 million companies have this problem once a week. I would suggest to you that the strongest of these 3 is the last one. The first one's pretty well meaningless. The second one is dangerous because I'm suggesting that my price of $4,000 is going to stick. Well, what happens if, due to competitive pressures, I have to drop my price by half and I go to $2,000? Does that mean that all of a sudden the market is half the size? No, it's silly. So the third one is the statement powerful. And the scalability of a business. If there are 1 million companies that problem I solve at least once a week, it's like, ooh, this is like really good. Okay, so be very thoughtful about how you present market size. Let's look at solution. So now I've talked about my elevator pitch, the problem I solve, the size of the problem in the world, and here's our solution. And we want to be very careful here not to sound like we're selling a product to the audience. We're trying to sell the value proposition of our product as a feature of the business. Okay? Because remember, if you're talking to investors, you're talking about investment opportunities. You're not trying to sell them product. So you want to be able to talk about, does this solve the problem? Perhaps how, at a high level. But importantly, what's the value proposition that you offer to those potential buyers that you thought about earlier? Now, if you do this, sometimes it makes sense to bridge into competitive differentiation. So an example would be, here's the problem here's the solution we have to the problem. Our key value proposition is 1, 2, 3. And the reason people will buy us rather than competition are the following reasons. So you've just bridged into competitive differentiation. That's okay. If it supports the dialogue at this point, that's okay. But you don't have to do it here. You're going to see in a moment there's a second opportunity to do competitive differentiation. Just questions, okay?
Frank?
Yes?
You broke up a bit when you were speaking about the market size feedback. The market size, and I think it was the previous slide before this one. You are breaking up a lot. We barely heard you.
Okay.
Yeah,
on this one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me go back. So the key message here is there's multiple ways to describe market sizes. I encourage people to use counts because they're more impactful. If you look at these 3 ways of describing a market size, the first one is meaningless. Like, what does $4 billion really mean in the context of my business anyways? The second one is dangerous because if I say that 1 million companies in our space, if they bought our solution for $4,000 a year, we're a $4 billion opportunity. Well, the point is 1 million companies are not going to buy your solution and your price might not stick. And if you have to drop your price for competitive reasons or whatever, all of a sudden you have to describe your market as being half the size. Well, that's not good. So the most powerful of these is 1 million companies experience the problem that we solve at least once a week. Like, wow, if I was an investor and somebody said this, that would be a big wow, because that tells me that there are 52 million reasons every single year for companies to be looking at this solution. Okay, Gabemi, how's the sound?
The sound is good. I think there was an example you gave that people wanted to know the final description that you gave at the end of the example. But I think the sound is good now. You probably can keep going.
Okay. So once I cover the problem, the elevator space, I cover the problem, I cover the market size. Now I can talk about the solution. The key thing about the solution here is we want to be able to describe the solution in terms that an investor wants to hear, not for the purpose of trying to sell the solution to the investor, because they're not there to buy a license. They're not there to buy a product, right? They're not there to sign up for the marketplace. They need to understand the value proposition that you propose to potential buyers that you would have talked about. Once you do that, sometimes you can bridge into your competitive differentiation. So for example, if you said, here's our solution and our value propositions are 1, 2, 3, and the reason that we'll win versus competition are the following reasons, that's an okay place to go. You could also do competitive differentiation later, and I'll cover that in just a moment. And Gabemi, I'm going to stop for questions in just a moment here.
Okay.
When you go through competitive, people use different kinds of formats. Sometimes it's a Venn diagram. Sometimes it's some kind of a comparison table with check marks or X's, or we call these Harvey balls or consumer report balls, or an N by N matrix, a 2 by 2 matrix, or something else. Couple of pointers here. One is, if you use this to describe you versus others, and you say, competitor 1 does this, competitor 2 does this, competitor 3 does this, but we're the only ones that do all 3. That sounds reasonable, but it also makes you look like you're surrounded. And you're probably surrounded by companies that have a lot of money. So if you're going to use that kind of mechanism, you got to be very thoughtful and be able to answer questions like, how are you going to survive if Google decides to do what you do, or Facebook decides to do what you do? Okay, so it's not necessarily a good framework for that. It is, however, excellent for illustrating customer segments, right? So you could talk about customer segments using this in terms of what are the profiles and who are you focusing on, the overlap, but it's typically not great for competitive. Could be, but not necessarily. If you're using a comparison table or a 2 by 2 or N by N matrix, what you want to be very careful of here is that the features that you're talking about in the comparison table or the axes that you're using in the matrix, they're meaningful. They're not just there to make you look good, because competitors will see through that. At some point, they're going to say, wait a second now, you just listed a bunch of things that only make you look good. They don't even reflect reality. And now you've lost all credibility. Okay, so you have to be pretty objective and pretty honest with yourself about the competitive analysis that you do. It's one of the things that I look very closely at when I look at pitches. The last part of the yellow section, and I'm going to pause right after the yellow section, is why now? This was popularized by a VC in the Valley called Sequoia. I love the question, and I love the answer even more. And let me give you some really good examples of why now answers. The best why now answer you could give has to do with traction. For example, we just sold 100,000 units, and we're now raising money to be able to get the inventory to build another 250,000 units to be able to continue the momentum, right? Investing into something that continues or accelerates the momentum is really, really powerful. This is about fuel on the fire. Investors love that. So that's the best why now answer you can give. The second best, in my view, is we're on the bleeding or leading edge of something, and we are in the leading position to be first to market, and we want you to bet on us because we think we're going to win this race. I've met with companies that are in the nanotechnology space, and when I ask them about their why now, they give me a really good answer. They say, look, 2 years ago, this technology didn't exist. And now that it exists, there's a lot of people that are trying to do something with it. We happen to think we're in the lead. Here are our reasons for us being in the lead. And we think you should bet on us because we're the leading racehorse. That can be a pretty compelling reason. Okay. Another reason, less good, is regulatory change. So if we go back to the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, that time period, following that financial crisis, the governments came out and really elevated the risk management requirements for banks. That opened the doors for companies to come out with risk management platforms. And now their answer to that question was, well, it's the right time to be betting on us because the government has just told all the banks they have to have a solution like us. So banks are out there looking, right? Think of this in the COVID-19 case. With COVID-19 here, there are all kinds of new opportunities that have come up as a result of COVID-19 and more to come. And if you believe that there's a second wave coming, and this next wave could be worse than this one because there could be other things that happen in that wave, what are the kinds of opportunities that could come out as a result of that being in place, and can you capitalize on that, right? So there are companies out there that have capitalized on the COVID-19, people that have pivoted to create shields, for example, right? Now, the last one, which is certainly the weakest of the four, it can be usable, but it's the weakest, is you've got some really deep research. Maybe you did some research as part of a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis, or you're leveraging somebody else's research to provide some insights that say, now's the time, this is going to explode, but you don't have any firm evidence yet, but the research says. That can work at times, but just be aware that of these four, it's the weakest. And sometimes you may not have a good why now answer. And if you don't have a really good why now answer, bypass it. Because if you try to manufacture a good why now answer and it looks like you did, it's going to backfire on you, and it's going to, instead of being a why now, they're going to drop the W and it's going to be a why no. Okay. So, do this only if you have a good, compelling reason. So we've covered all the yellow stuff. Remember I said the yellow stuff generates interest. Those things can do no more than cause an investor to say, oh, this is kind of interesting. And they lean in and they want to listen. Okay. I'm going to pause here just to see if there are any questions before I go on to the next piece, which is the meat of the sandwich. Are there any questions?
Yeah, there are at least 4 questions in the chat.
Okay.
Peter asked a second question about, can you speak a bit more about recovering cadence?
Recovering cadence?
Yes.
When you're interrupted with a question?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Please.
So the example would be you're in a one-on-one meeting and an investor says to you, oh, you have a pitch? I'll tell you what, I'll let you give your pitch and I'll save all my questions till the end. However, they can't help themselves. So when a question comes to their mind, even if they promised you that you're going to get to the end of your pitch, they're going to interrupt you. So now you've got the choice that you have to make. How do I deal with that? Well, the first choice should have been made before you went in the room in the first place, which is get those key pieces of information up front so that the questions are strong. When you get a good question, it's okay to divert from your pitch, because what's subtly happened now is you've changed from a pitch to a dialogue, and you want to embrace the dialogue. The dialogue is very important because now you are talking about the things that's important to the investor rather than your best guess as to what it is and the story you want to tell. you'll eventually be able to get to everything you want to tell, but you're just going to do it by following their lead, and you're going to do it happily because that dialogue is worth its weight in gold. Now, let's say that the question is not a very good one, and you recognize that, and you're now trying to recover that cadence. I'm going to go to Peter's question now. The way you recover from an interruption like that is based on how well you've rehearsed your pitch. So you should never go into a pitch situation without having rehearsed your pitch many times with many people and taken that advice and reworked your pitch based on that advice. If you do that enough times, you are going to be very confident in your delivery, and you're going to have this natural ability to recover from interruptions because you know exactly what you're talking about and you know where to go. There are some other tricks that I can talk about as well. If you put hyperlinks in your document, it allows you to go back and forth in your document very quickly, rather than trying to go page forward, and page back to find things. Hyperlinks are really good. But Peter, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, there was another question quickly from Fauzia that for the 3 to 5 minute pitch, I think that's on August 6th, which of the 10 criteria would you prioritize?
I'd like you to hold that question. I'm going to come to that at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a question, another one from here that says, does a pitch deck replace a business plan, or do you need both?
Oh, I love this question. So in my view, a pitch is simply a presentation version of your business plan. Now, there's two schools of thoughts out there about whether or not business plans are, quote unquote, formal business plans are needed. And you really have to make your own decision on this. If you think you're going to go to a banker or to some other kind of non-angel investor, they are more likely to ask for a formal business plan than, say, an angel investor. A family member is not likely to ask for a business plan, but a VC might. So in my view, what I encourage people to do is to write a high-level business plan and certainly have it backed up by a financial plan. That's the most important part of this, the financial plan. And then have a pitchable version of the business plan, which happens to be the pitch. And it happens to be the framework that I'm talking about here, because I could write a 100-page document that follows this framework and call it a business plan. The problem is nobody would read it, right? And even if you go to a bank and they say, we'd like your business plan, really all they care about is the financial part of the business plan. So you want to be cautious about where to put your effort, but sometimes we have to do formal business plans. Most of the times, most companies I'm seeing, the pitch represents the plan. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, there are a couple more questions. Fauzia, the question, if the competition is the status quo, how best to articulate it in the slides?
So status quo is the worst competition, because that means that somebody is willing to live with the problem rather than pay what it takes to fix the problem or go through the effort of what it costs or effort of fixing the problem. And you know, our own personal lives, we live with certain things rather than choosing to fix them. Well, enterprises are the same way. They, especially if they've lived with a problem for a long time, if they're faced with $1 million project to fix the problem, even if it makes them $5 million every year, they have to find that $1 million to work on that versus other things. So the way you battle that is, what's the strongest value proposition you can put on the table to convince somebody? Remember, a pitch is about convincing, to convince somebody to move forward with your idea. And sometimes, especially in the case of enterprise sales, you need to think about what the return on investment, the ROI formula is for them to be able to move that forward. And you could do that by simply having a meeting with somebody and saying, you know, I'd really like to propose a solution to you here, but I need to understand what your business case methodology is, or I need to understand how you calculate ROI. If you could share that with me, I'd love to be able to take that back to my team and come back in a couple of days with our best shot at showing you what the ROI is. You know, those kinds of dialogues are perfectly normal. Okay. So can we move on, Gabemi? I'll have more time for more questions later.
Okay, yeah, keep going.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. And you know, it's already 8:13. My prediction is I'm going to go to about 8:45. I hope that's okay. Gabemi?
Yeah, I think some people may need to go, but
Okay.
again, I think most people may stay on, but we have a recording, so I think it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize for the length, but you know, for you to be able to put the best foot forward August 6th, I want to really cover, you know, what's behind all these things. So now the blue part, right? The blue part is where interest begins to convert to action, begins to convert, isn't all the way there yet. And the blue part is the go-to-market. My framework for go-to-market is called Vegas, which stands for validate, enter, grow, and scale up. Validate is how have you or will you validate that this product makes sense, that people will pay for it, that the business makes sense. You know, what's your validation? It's kind of like product market fit, but it's actually a bit stronger than product market fit. The second is enter. What's your plan to launch the business, to launch the product, enter the market? The next one is, how do you plan to grow? So once you've entered, what's your growth plan? Is it to grow geographically? Is it to grow by adding more features and charging more? Is it to add more customer segments? And then scale up. What's your plan to, or what do you think the opportunity is to scale up this business? Now, people ask me, what's the difference between grow and scale? Grow is typically a controllable activity. I put actions in place and I expand the business. I go into a new geography. I add new features. I increase my price. I start selling to a new segment. Scale up is I start to lose control over what's happening. I have to keep up with demand, right? The best and yet the worst scale up opportunity is when sales or requests are coming in so fast that I have to really, you know, jump out of my shorts to be able to figure out how I keep up with that demand. I have to, you know, bring some new manufacturing operations online. I have to beg, borrow, and steal as many servers as I can and get them up and running because we're trying to keep up with demand. That scale up can be a really cool story. You're not expected to know the details of your scale up, but just being able to talk about what you're going to do for scale up would be helpful. In the document you're going to receive, you'll see this page here, which has a bit more of a write-up about what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go through this now, but it basically just describes what I just did, and it's for your reading pleasure later. How do you visualize your Vegas? I try to do it very, very simply with 4 boxes. You don't have to do it this way. Some people do. Some people come up with new frameworks for doing the Vegas. They're all good. As long as you can tell the Vegas story, it works. So you're going to notice these boxes are up and to the right for a purpose, right? So I could very quickly talk about with whom I validated, where did I validate, how I validated, and when. And I am also keeping track of what kinds of things I need to know for scaling. The gray boxes are just my internal notes. It's the blue boxes here that you need to pay attention to. So same thing for entry. You'll notice up and to the right. Now let's get to grow, up and to the right. And then what's the scale story? Okay. If you can put a framework like this in place, it becomes a very powerful communication method, a one-page communication method for what you're doing with the business over time. This could become a page that you carry around in your back pocket. And when people say, you know, so what's your business all about? You give them the elevator pitch, you give them a couple of words about the problem you solve and the solution that you have. And then you say, let me show you how we're deploying this business. And you could show them this. You could have this on one page, or if one of these boxes needs more detail, you do a separate page on that. But here's what you could do with this. Once you have it, you can also map other things on top of it. Like, you know, for validation, we raised $100,000 and bootstrapped the rest, and we achieved validation. And I'm looking for $250,000 to do this next phase, which is launch into the market. So now I've been able to use my go-to-market framework, the Vegas framework, to be able to show how it maps against funding. Okay, can be very powerful, and I'll give you some more examples on this. But before I get to the examples, you know, how might you develop a Vegas? I'm going to show you a bit of a worksheet that I'll do this very quickly, but you'll see that all you have to do is answer a few questions and you will have the Vegas story. This worksheet I'm showing you, this is not what you would put in front of investors. This is your worksheet to be able to figure out what this looks like. Okay, so when you have this worksheet, basically I have 4 columns here: validate, enter, grow, and scale up. You could rename these to whatever your phases need to be named, but this is what I call them. The first thing we're going to look at is what's the time frame that we think we're talking about, right? So now we're establishing that horizontal axis. What are the key targets that we're trying to achieve for each of these phases? What's the product differences in each of the stage? If I have a product roadmap that I'm also executing at the same time, I might have version 1 in validate, or maybe it's my MVP in validate, version 1 in enter, version 1.5 in grow, but I need version 2 to get the scale up. I can tell the story here, right? Really quickly. Who are my target segments that I'm going after in each phase? What are the geographies I'm going after? Maybe in validate, I'm focused on, you know, a very narrow segment in Toronto, but I'm going to enter the market in Ontario. And my grow strategy is to go east and west in Canada so that I cover all of Canada. And my scale up strategy is to hit the US, right? That's an example of geographic rollout. And how am I actually going to sell? Am I going to do this myself directly? Am I going to use channels? Am I going to use partners? Right? So if I can answer all these questions on my personal worksheet for my business, I've got a really nice map that's beginning to lay out for where my business is going. And then I can start to put it in the format of those 4 boxes. But there's 2 more things I want to talk about that you have to do. The first is I have to think about what I have to do before each of the stages, right? If I'm currently in an early stage, I'm in an incubator, and I'm going to be validating my product in a couple of months, the question is, what are the things I have to do before I get into that stage to set me up for validation? Once I'm in validation, what are the things I think I have to do to set me up for enter, right? Similarly for getting into grow, and similarly for grow for scale up. I'm beginning to think, what are those things I have to do in advance? In addition, of course, I'm going to describe what are the activities I have to do within each column to achieve the business target that I talked about on in section number 2 there, right? So if I have this worksheet, and you could do this on a whiteboard, you could do it in an Excel sheet or a Google Sheets page. You know, if you can map this out for your business, even at a high level, you can then take this and distill it into this page, right? So now you've got high level this page backed up by the other one, and if you've built the other one, you have a really good understanding. Now, take this a couple steps further. This becomes a very flexible communication canvas because I could use that same framework to talk about funding. I could use it to talk about a product roadmap, right? Visualize it. I could visualize my sales strategy over time. I could visualize my manufacturing plans over time. And once I have that, I could actually smash them all together. And at the end of the day, I have this one page here that tells the whole story about my business. And I'm just picking 4 things, right? Sales, manufacturing, product, and funding. There's all kinds of things you could be talking about here. Now, this is not something I would put into the pitch like this. It's too dense, but it becomes a wonderful piece of paper for you to be carrying around and for you to be, you know, sharing with your team saying, this is where we're going and this is why. And it's not just about getting this page done, it's all the homework you've done to get there. Okay, so Keeping in mind that the go-to-market piece is what investors really came to hear. Every company's got a problem to solve. They've got good-sized markets. They've got a solution with value propositions. They can talk about their competitiveness, but where the rubber hits the road and where the difference is made in a pitch to an investor is how well you talk about your go-to-market. So that's why I spent so much time on the go-to-market piece. If you are a early stage and you don't have the go-to-market well thought out yet, you can still talk about it at a high level. It will impress your audience that you've thought about it, okay? In the document that I'm sending you, there are pages for each of these scenarios that talk about the kinds of things you have to include in your go-to-market. I'll just give you an example. So if you're thinking about validating and entering, these are the kinds of things you need to think about in terms of presenting to an audience. But I'm not going to go through them in detail because we don't have time. I knew we wouldn't have time, and you see I have a hyperlink right here. If I hit this, we're going to skip a bunch of pages. Okay? So I've just talked about the meat of the hamburger, the meat of the sandwich. I'm going to pause for a moment, Gubemi, just to see if there's any specific questions about go-to-market before I hit the last part here and before I get to the August 6th date.
Okay, specific to go-to-market, there's a question from Leanne. What will be the typical key business target in the validate stage?
Well, it could be things like revenue target, right? A monthly recurring revenue or annual recurring revenue, or it might be number of users. It's going to be something that's meaningful that measures the progress of your business, right? If I have a software as a subscription business, I might say that, I believe I'll be validated if I can hit 10,000 in MRR, monthly recurring revenue. That's going to be my signal to move forward and launch, assuming that everything else is in place like the product. And then when I enter the market, my target for my first market is to hit 65,000 MRR because Ontario's a big market. My segments are well defined. I have a way to get to them all. I know how I'm going to sell to them. It's going to take me a year to get to that 65,000, but that's my plan. And I'm not going to divert myself from that plan, and I won't start growing until I hit that milestone, right? That's the kind of thing you could use. Okay?
All right.
All right. So you'll notice that I added two things to this chart here. It says deeper thinking. What's happening here is the yellow causes the investor or the audience, whoever they may be, to get interested in what you're talking about. But this process of initiating conversion to action, it's really causing them to think more deeply about your business so that they can start to think about, geez, I want to learn more. Or in the case that you're going to have when you pitch to DMZ on August 6th, how do you get the audience to start thinking about good questions, right? That's the deeper thinking part. So let's move on to the bottom part here. Remember I said that you could do competitive differentiation before the go-to-market or after the go-to-market. So if you didn't cover it here, you can certainly cover it in the post go-to-market. And the same things apply that I talked about earlier. The next is the business model. So the business model has a couple of key pieces. One is the revenue model. In other words, how do you make money? Is this a subscription business? Is this a one-time sale? Is this an advertising click revenue business? Is it a marketplace where I'm getting a percentage of the sale that happens from one or both parties? How do I make money? And then what's the key measure and metric for my business? For example, if I'm a SaaS business, then I need to make sure that I can talk about I can talk SaaS language, because investors are very, very smart about SaaS businesses these days. And if you're not talking the SaaS language, they're not going to believe that you really understand a SaaS business. And what's interesting about SaaS is there's only a few key metrics that an investor needs to do in their head to figure out whether or not this is a healthy business or a business that's actually dying and nobody realizes it yet. Okay, so you got to think about the SaaS language. Any business, you could very well get asked about gross margin. And that is something that you need, if you're at the right stage, you need to be able to talk about gross margin. Even if your gross margin sucks today, right? If your gross margin is pulling numbers out of the air, if your gross margin is 30% today and the industry average is 80%, then what you say to people is, oh, today our gross margin is 30%, but we know how we're going to get to 85, right? That's the key part that the investor is going to want to hear. They will accept the fact that you're early and your gross margin's terrible, or if you're a SaaS business, your cost of customer acquisition is really terrible today. You know, it costs us $4,000 to get a customer today, but we know how to get it to 450. Okay? It's that knowing how to get there that becomes important. User counts are important. Remember I talked earlier about counts are more important sometimes. But in some businesses, you don't want to count downloads or registered users. It needs to be active users, because that's the number that really matters. And then if there's something else that's important to the business that I haven't listed, then you include that. Now, I'm not saying that you talk about 10 different metrics here. You pick a couple of metrics to talk about, and that's it. That's all you need to talk about. The other part of this is you want to give people some sense of your projections. And of course, investors and founders are looking for hockey stick curves. But if you have a hockey stick curve, be prepared for the question that says, how are you going to get from today to tomorrow and increase your sales 10 times? Like, how are you actually going to do that? If you can't answer that question, all of a sudden your hockey stick curve is worthless. It just has no credibility. The other thing to think about is if you're going to say, you know what, we're going to do what another famous company did years ago to get the same results. You better have done your research about things like how much money they had in the bank to do that. I had one company who said, we're going to do what LinkedIn did when they were at our stage to get a couple of 100,000 users. And I said to them, well, I said, did you check to see how much money LinkedIn had in the bank at the time to do what you're doing? And they said, no. We got onto Crunchbase. We did a little bit of work. We did a little bit of digging. And we determined that they probably had about 6 million in the bank to do what this company wanted to do. And they were looking for $100,000. I said, doesn't make sense. And by the way, if you're trying to get 200,000 users in a social media business, social network business, you're missing a zero. Because investors, don't care unless there's 6 or 7 zeros there. So you want to be really, really careful. Okay, I've got to move quickly. Team, if you're going to talk about you have to talk about your team, what people are looking for in team is, what is it about this team that establishes credibility for the space that you're in? It could be educational, it could be previous jobs you've had. You also want to be able to show that you've attracted good talent. And very importantly, you want to be able to talk about the gaps on the team. That may seem a little unintuitive, but if you're looking for money from an investor, or if you're trying to get into a program, the program or the investor want to know that you have a good grasp on the business and you know where you need help and what kind of help you need. And if you're talking to an investor, the investor might actually know how to close that gap for you. They might say, I know somebody that could do that, and I'd love to make an introduction. Or they might want to do it. So it's an opportunity to be advertising your gaps, not hiding them. The ask. The perfect ask in a pitch is you recap what you've raised to date, because that tells me something about your ability to raise money, or your commitment because you're bootstrapped, or your commitment because you raise money from friends and family, or your ability to get grants. Those all tell me something. And then what did you achieve with that? And what are you looking for today to execute what part of your go-to-market plans? And this is why the milestones need to be important in your go-to-market plans, because you're going to tie it to your ask. Okay? And then the last page is, give me a summary of the 3 things you want me to remember in the pitch. Because if I'm the wrong person in my firm for this pitch, but you want to arm me to be able to go back to the office and say, hey, Sally, I just saw a pitch from this company, and here are the 3 things that I need you here's the 3 things I want to tell you, and I think you should call the founder. All right, so 3 key things from the pitch you put in here. So we've talked about all these things. I just noticed my numbering scheme's out of whack versus the rest, but I'll fix that. These are the things: you generate interest, you cause them to do deeper thinking, and you lead them to the action by giving them all the things they need to know. Now, a couple other things from a content point of view. Don't forget to choose your script and content to meet the requirements of your venue. Here I'm talking about uninterrupted versus one-on-one. Don't leave interpretation to chance. If you need an investor to get something about your pitch page, tell them what you want them to get. Put it in letters on the page. Because if you leave it for them to draw their conclusions, most of the time they're not going to draw the conclusion you want. So don't leave that to chance. Avoid dense pages. Investors do not like to read pages. Use the page as a support for your script, not the other way around. So that'll encourage you to use fewer words and easy to consume diagrams. Q&A, it's as important to practice your Q&A as it is to practice the pitch, because a bad Q&A can kill a good pitch, and good Q&A can rescue a bad pitch. Okay, so Q&A becomes important. Trick here is keep a log of the questions you get asked and keep track of the preferred answer you want to give and rehearse them. And every time you run into a new question, add it to the log. This will become very valuable to you down the road. In this document, I include a page of the kinds of questions that I see frequently. I don't have the COVID piece on this yet, but people are asking lots of questions about COVID these days. What did it mean to your business? What's it mean going forward? But these are the kinds of things that you can expect people to be asking about. In the document you're going to get is a self-assessment that you could use to evaluate your own pitch. This is if you did a full pitch. Happy to share that with you. So now we're almost finished. I'm gonna now get to prepping for August 6th and some closing thoughts. We'll do this probably fairly quickly. So to prepare for August 6th, it's really about finding a balance between a few things so that you have a good, memorable pitch for the DMZ audience. Remember, the DMZ audience is there for you to unveil your company and to have them remember you, because sometime down the road you might want to apply for a program, or sometime soon they might want to approach you to say, you know what, we think we have a perfect program for you and we love what you're doing and we'd like you to participate in this. So this is about helping them remember all about you, a good memorable, right? So you start by asking yourself 3 questions. What do I think DMZ wants or needs to know about me and my company? You could do a little brainstorming of this on your own, but you could also just simply ask someone at DMZ saying, what's the most important thing you'd like to know about my business, right? About my business. This goes to one of the questions earlier about how to prioritize. The second is, what else do I think is important for DMZ to know about my business? Because you know your business or your business idea better than anybody. And if there's something that you really want to put on the table to impress somebody, then you better get it on the table. But remember, easy to consume. And the last thing is, what did I learn from this program? You're pitching to DMZ. DMZ is the host of the program you're in. I think they'd be very interested in knowing what you learned from this program, because that's something that's important to them. And it might lead to some real interesting dialogue between you and them. So I would start with those three questions. On the other side, I would think about, how do I put together a storyline that does 3 things? Guess what? The first one is capture interest of the audience right away. The second one is, how do I get them to think deeper about my company? So I want to convert the interest to thinking deeper, right? We don't have to just use go-to-market to do that. You may have some other mechanisms to get them to think deeper. And then the last one is, how do I stimulate and invite good questions? Because there is going to be a Q&A piece after this. And the way you prepare for all this, you refine and you rehearse your pitch, and you refine and you rehearse your Q&A, right? A very important page here in terms of what to do, how to go forward, and the kinds of things you have to do to get ready. Now, What's the content? Well, you know, we have a puzzle of all these kinds of things. And I've walked through everything on this page in the pitch that I just went through. But you have to decide which pieces in which order make the most sense for me. That takes a little bit of work, right? And the first time you put it together, you're going to think, oh, this is perfect. And then you're going to run it by somebody and they're going to say, you know what, I got part of it, but then you lost me. It just doesn't make sense. Pay attention to that kind of advice, because now you get a chance to rejig your order, change some of the words, change some of the content, get rid of some of the complex diagrams or language, and it'll help you figure out which pieces to use in which order. And you may have a couple of topics that are unique to your business that don't appear on here. You might very well. You know, in this version, I don't have anything about COVID-19 directly, but if you have a business that's driven by COVID-19 or driven by, you know, cultural change, those kinds of things could definitely be here. So consider a flow like this for yours. This might work for a DMZ pitch, but it really depends on what you want to do. Strong intro. What's the problem you solve? What's the importance and size of that problem? What's your solution? What are your next steps? This is an easy way to talk about go-to-market and various other things without having to get into a detailed go-to-market. But if you get into just the next steps of what we're doing, because I understand some of the businesses are pretty early stage, that'll work. What's the team? You know, who's on the team, and you know, what am I looking for? And then a strong closing. What are the 3 things you want people to remember? You get right into Q&A at this point. The document that you're going to get has a page on each of these. I won't go through them, but they're there. And trying to get to my last page here. Closing thoughts. Really quick closing thoughts. Design your pitch, anytime you're pitching. Design your pitch to meet your objective. Ask yourself, what do I want to get out of this pitch? You know, sometimes it's I want to be good, memorable. Sometimes it's I need to get to next steps. And don't try to overshoot by going for something that's too early in your life cycle. Right? If you're not ready for things, don't push yourself on the content. Don't force the pitch. Tell the story your company represents. Don't try to speak to topics you're not ready to defend via follow-up questions. You might be clever and be able to put a good go-to-market page together, but then if you get asked a question about it and you can't answer the next level question, all of a sudden that cleverness goes out the window. Remember, it's a small world. Make sure that your core messages are the same with whoever you're talking about, because it's a small world. And lastly, cycle through the process of refining, reviewing, rehearsing as often as you need, not as often as you want, but as often as you need to get to a good solid pitch. Remember, it's not just about the pitch, it's also about the Q&A. These are all the things we've covered. The document has all of these in I hope, sufficient detail. These are the kinds of things that I talk about. It's mostly pitching, but I do all kinds of things. And Gabemi, if we have time for a few more questions, I'm okay for time.
Okay, thanks for that, Frank. That's really great content out there. I'm not going to read from the chat. I just want to ask if anyone has a pressing question that they want to ask now. You can go ahead. We'll probably take one question. I know it's a competition right now. All right, I'll probably just pick one question from the chat room. The last question I see here is from Adrian. I'm just going through the sequence. If you are pre-revenue but you have projections, data-backed projections, should you push the financials or minimize?
Sorry, can you read that again, Gabemi?
Adrian said, if you're pre-revenue but you have projections that are data-backed, should you push the financials or minimize?
If you're pre-revenue, investors want to know where you think the company is going to go. So as long as you couch it to say, look, we're pre-revenue, we don't have enough good data yet to come up with good projections, but these are the best projections we have right now. And by the way, here are the 2 key assumptions. And what you'll find is the investors will be more interested in the assumptions than they are in the final projections, because they won't believe your projections anyways, and neither will you, right? But it gives you a sense, it gives the audience a sense for where you think this could potentially go. And I've seen situations like this where somebody puts a projection on the table and they talk about their variables, and the discussion goes on the variables, and then the investor looks at them and says, you know what? I think you're understating your projections by quite a bit. I honestly think that if you do the right things, you've got a much bigger opportunity here than you think you do. And by the way, you're asking for $100,000. I think you should ask for 250. I'm not interested at 100, but I'm interested if you ask for 250. Okay? You'd be surprised how the tables can turn sometimes in these discussions, because if an investor thinks that there's a really good opportunity here, they will tell you you're not asking for enough money, that you should be investing more, you should be doing more, and there's a bigger opportunity than even you realize at this point. So never leave things to be for granted, and use every opportunity as an opportunity to test what you're thinking.
Awesome. That's really good, Frank. So, I mean, one thing I can do again, Frank, and if you're open to this, we can book some kind of office hours, even if it's 15 minutes, but any team that is interested, just block that in your calendar so anyone that is interested and has a question can book some time, probably sometime next week.
Yeah. So Gabemi, you and I can talk about when those office hours are. We'll do that.
Okay.
The other thing that I can offer to do, and I'm happy to do this, is if you send me the questions that are in the chat,
Okay.
I will send you the answers, and
Okay.
you can share that. You can share that with people.
All right, that would be good too. I'm going to send it to questions then. All right,
Okay.
thanks a lot, Frank, and this has been a really good session.